What's up, everyone? Welcome to the Down Dog Athletics Podcast. My name is Paul Klingen, and I am your host. I'm a former D1 baseball player, personal trainer, and yoga instructor out of Seattle, Washington. Down Dog Athletics is dedicated to breaking the stigma around mental health, yoga, and meditation for men, athletes, and the hypercompetitive so they can unlock a higher version of themselves. That's what this podcast is all about, bridging the gap between the two. Today's guest is Karon Hawkins. He is a mobility expert. I was on his podcast recently, the Kronic Lifestyle podcast. He's an online coach and trainer, and just really one of the best resources I have found for movement, anything flexibility, mobility related, especially if you got a yoga practice, you're going upside down. This guy's going to be able to show you how to get into the proper positions and open up any mobility restrictions that you might have. So without further ado, Karan.
What's up, man? How's it going?
I'm doing well, brother. How are you?
Awesome. So met Karan at a mastermind with Cody McBroom, and I've been blown away, like I said in the intro, about a lot of the mobility stuff that he's able to share, just his knowledge and how all the different joints move, what joint health really looks like. And from a yoga perspective, I find it really interesting that he's able to kind of get into the science and get into a lot of the things when I'm flowing and feel like, all right, I got really good range of motion. It's nice to have a resource like him to be able to know, like, okay, this is what you actually have. This is what your controlled range of motion is. So I think that's one of the first things that I want to talk about, man, is what is the difference between mobility and flexibility? Where does one have a ton of value, and where does the other take precedence? I think people are like, oh, I want to get really flexible, and I think that's important. You don't want really tight muscles, but at the same time, there's a difference between the two. So I'll let you go into it as the expert.
Sure. Thank you. Well, first, I want to thank you for having me on the show. It's an honor to be here. The next thing I want to say is they're both important for sure. You can't have one without the other, and vice versa. So here's the main difference between mobility and flexibility: active strength and control. Those are the two main components that mobility has that flexibility does not have. So put it simply, flexibility plus strength equals mobility. Flexibility is just having the ability to lengthen tissue, your muscles, uh, ligaments, tendons, etc., through a specific range of motion, not necessarily with your own body, but think about someone, you're on a table and someone's like pushing your leg towards your chest, right? For like a hamstring stretch. That's flexibility because that person is just lengthening the tissue behind your leg, your hamstring, your calves, etc., and your glute to get you into that position. Mobility would be you're laying on your back and now there's no one helping you, and you can only use your own strength and your own muscular tissue to get into that position. So you have to physically lift your leg towards your chest, right? That would be mobility. And again, the difference between that and someone pushing you is the active strength to get there. Specifically, having strength not just on the back of the leg, but the front of the leg. So your quads and your hip flexors and your abs have to physically pull your leg towards your chest, right? Because when someone's pushing you, your quads don't have to do anything. They're just kind of along for the ride. But when you don't have that help to get into that position with that passive help, that's what we call it, passive flexibility. Um, you have to do it yourself. So I mean, and you see this a lot in certain yoga positions and yoga practices. People will like pull their legs into certain positions. They'll pull their arms and pull this and that to a certain position to adhere to a certain pose. But now, if you ask them to do that without like pulling anything there, just like actively getting into those different positions, things get kind of funky because a lot of the time the gap in between what's active or what's actual strength and control of the joints through a specific range of motion is missing because the gap between that and the passive flexibility is so large. For so many years, for so many times, that person has just pulled themselves and been manipulated by other people and other, bands and walls into certain positions. But when you ask them to do it on their own, that control and strength is missing. So I don't want to sit here and tell you that yoga is bad. I don't want to sit here and tell you that flexibility is bad, because it's not. I mean, there are certain a lot of benefits that go past just, being strong and being flexible and everything. There's a lot of uh, mindful awareness and mindset and meditative benefits that come from yoga. But from a strict mobility perspective, if you're just pulling yourself into positions over and over again, you're not receiving the strength, active control, and specifically through a certain range of motion benefits that mobility gives you. So the two are used interchangeably often, but they're very, very, very different. And the goal, I mean, is just to be able to have as small of a gap between your passive flexibility and your active mobility, so that when you're put into awkward positions passively, like, maybe you're picking up something or you're stretching somewhere behind your car, you don't necessarily do that position often, but you train in all your range of motions, and you have control in all of your range of motions, so that you don't reach over to get something in your car and pull, and, like, pull a muscle or feel weird, and your back's thrown out for the rest of the week. So I mean, there's this real application to mobility, because we all have positions we need to access daily, and we all have certain movements that we do daily that we sort of take for granted because they're easy and they're this and they're that. But the moment that position gets limited by your body, and gets limited by your joints and the capability and the capacity of those joints to take load, even is something as small as, like, reaching at the top of your shelf and getting a can of beans, right? That's overhead mobility. Like, being able to put your arm over your head is such a fundamental movement that we don't really think about. But yeah, I know that's kind of a long-winded answer, but that's basically the difference.
No, and there's several things I want to unpack with that
Sure.
questions with. Hopefully, people listening are taking notes. I've already written down several. I think the first thing that people with stretching sometimes that comes to mind is, it's like ego. It's like, oh, I gotta hit this pose, or I gotta get my leg, if I'm laying on my back, straight, otherwise it appears that I don't have that flexibility. So I think the first thing that comes with mobility work, stretching, anything with that, is just to, like, leave your ego at the door and realize that you
Absolutely.
hurt yourself or slow down the rate at which you can improve if you don't just accept where you are with that.
Absolutely. I'd like to dive into that a little bit, actually, because that's a big part of improving your mobility. The ego is not just something that's, excuse me, sometimes detrimental to a mental growth, but also physically. If you're forcing your body in certain positions it's not ready for, like with a mobility, regimen or exercise or anything like that, your body's literally going to fight you. I mean, it's going to hurt. It's going to feel shitty. And when you're in that painful state where your body's not ready to accept change and progressively and safely adapt, your nervous system literally fights you. You tighten up, and you can't move into those positions. You can't gain strength there because your body is just trying to protect itself.
Yeah.
So this is where stretching does come into play, and adequate breath work comes into play. If you're breathing the right way, nasal breathing through your nose, out through your nose, um, you're physiologically calming down your body, not just physiologically with the decreased heart rate and blood pressure and all that, but your nervous system kind of just tapers down, and
Yeah.
it's ready to accept changes. But if you're going through a stretch and you're and like cringing up, of course you're not going to make changes because your body's not ready to be there. So you got to take it step by step. And when you stretch for ideally 2 minutes. I know it's a long time to hold the stretch, but that's what it takes. Sometimes even longer, especially depending upon how long you've been quote unquote tight in that area or weak in that area, or lacking range of motion. If you've been expressing your movement in a very short range of motion, I think of heavy lifting. Sometimes we limit the range of motion to achieve a lift, there's nothing wrong with that. But if we continue that pattern across every single joint in the body, now you've trained your body to only move from, A to B when you have daily tasks that require A to F,
Yeah.
right? But if you only train A to B, A to B, A to B, A to B, you're teaching your body that, hey, I can only take load in A to B. But when I go to F, I'm not really ready for that. So that's where injuries happen, because that missing gap of like it's basically capacity um, in the joints to take load in those ranges of motion. And when that gap is huge, you put yourself in an awkward position and you reach for your can of beans and you maybe twinge a little bit and it hurts. It's like, whoa, what the fuck? I can overhead press, 200 pounds, but this can of beans is weird. You know
Yeah.
what I mean? So, I mean, then we would look at your overhead press. Are you actually achieving um, flexion of the shoulder at the necessary degree? Like, are you actually getting your arms by your ears without your ribs flaring, or without your lower back arching, or without, your neck pushing forward? Like, are you actually achieving this position honestly?
Yeah.
So, again, the ego needs to be left out the door for you to actually make changes and go into proper positions and gain strength and gain mobility. And two, you have to be honest. Like, you have to be honest with yourself, because you won't make changes. You just won't.
Yeah. Where does something like PNF fit in between that? Because you're working sometimes with yourself, sometimes with another person. You're pressing into it. Um, but like, how would you describe that, and where does that kind of fit? I think the next question, right, to follow up with that is like, in what order would you work on these? Is it mobility before a lift, stretching after? Let you dig into
Yeah,
it.
good question. Yeah, great question. And so, with PNF, like the pushing and then the relaxing, the pushing and the relaxing, that definitely has benefits. I would say the stuff that I do with my clients is sort of like a step, like the next step to that, because you have to be able to pull out of that position, not just go into it.
Yeah.
So when I say pull out, like you have to have strength on both sides of the joint, and
Yeah.
that's what the FRC stuff talks
Yep.
about, like being strong on both sides of the joint, which is why I really like it so much. But in terms of like what order I would do, so it's very dependent upon what the client needs and what the client wants to do. So let's just talk about, we were talking about overheads. So let's get into overhead mobility, right?
Cool.
So let's say the client wants to strict press overhead, you know, X amount of pounds. But in the assessment, you start bringing them from the arms down at the sides of the body. You start bringing them up, bringing them up, bringing them up, bringing them up, bringing them up. Ooh, they don't quite reach 180 degrees of shoulder flexion. Maybe they're at like, I don't know. Let's just say they're pretty tight and they're at like 120 or 130. So that's like maybe by the chin or a little higher. Um, then you know that there's no way they're going to be pressing overhead safely, right? Because their shoulders physically can't get there on their own. So why am I loading that position, especially when the gap is so big? When you have 60 or 50 degrees left of overhead mobility, specifically in shoulder flexion. Again, that's just lifting your arms over your head without seeing compensations like the lower back arch or the ribs flare, or other things happen. That person doesn't have control. That person doesn't have actual strength there. So, as I said, to again load that position would be detrimental, and they definitely get injured at some point. It's only a matter of time. So, how do we fix that, and how do we take steps to improve that mobility? First, just so the client can feel happy and enjoy the process while working on mobility, you modify the exercise to fit their current level of mobility and prerequisites achieved. Um, I don't like, if someone wants to overhead press and I see that they don't have the quite the mobility for it, I'm like, all right, no pressing for 6 months. That's bullshit. Like I want to press. I like pressing.
Yep.
So modifying that position is doing something like a landmine, where you can modify the torso angle
Yeah.
to achieve that same quote unquote overhead feel without necessarily having to be straight up. So if you know that they can get to 120 degrees and that's quote unquote their overhead, rotate the torso to that 120 degrees so that they can achieve that adequate shoulder flexion to adhere to that position. And obviously there's a limit to that. If they're like, if they start arching at at their chest, maybe like 90 degrees, which is pretty unlikely, but you can't landmine press there. But the point remains: if they're tight, they're probably going to get before their ear before they start seeing compensation. So just modify that torso angle to fit what they have, and then from there, we work on increasing that overhead mobility. So we look at shoulder flexion, we look at shoulder internal rotation. What most people don't know is that when you go into overhead, your shoulders just don't kind of stay and go up. There's rotation at the actual ball and socket joint, and when you're pressing, there's rotation. So we have to look at how the shoulder internally and externally rotates. We have to look at all the positions the shoulder can get into, so there's no missing gaps. But specifically for shoulder flexion, I might have that person go prone or lay on their stomach, um, engage their glutes and abs, so they're going into posterior pelvic tilt. And if they have some issues with like some lordosis, or they have like curvature at the lower spine, I might put a yoga mat under their belly button to give their lumbar some support while they get into this position. But I'm going to tell them, squeeze your abs like someone's about to punch you, and squeeze your butt. And then I'm going to say, try and lift your arms up, and we're going to see what they can do. Chances are, if they're limited at 120 or 130, they're not going to be able to lift their arms off the ground, and that's totally okay. So if we see that doesn't work, then we just modify the position. Again, you have to fit the exercises to the client. You can't just say, we're going to do this exercise because it's good for your shoulders. We have to say, we're going to do this exercise because it's good for you and your shoulders. The concept of specificity is very huge when it comes to improving mobility and improving strength. You have to make sure that you're adhering to what the client can and cannot do. I'm not going to stick someone in a certain position or a certain exercise when I know they don't have the prerequisites for it.
Right. Yeah, I love that, dude. So many.
Thanks.
Um, so going into, you mentioned a lot of like overhead with the arms and the ribs flaring, low back arching. I think that's one of the most common ones I see. Anyone going upside down in a handstand, you can usually see that get exposed right away because they look like a banana, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Ribbed out, shoulders aren't pressed all the way. Some of it's just a body awareness thing. Some people might have it, but that for me is one of the most common butchered, where it's like, look what I can do, and it's like, can you really? What are a couple other? So we'll call that number one. What are two other things that you see where people think that they're getting the mobility that they think they're getting because maybe they're flexible, but in reality, they still have some work to do?
Yeah, good question. I would say another common exercise that's seen as a gym exercise, but that's really a life exercise or just a life movement, is the squat. Um, the squat wasn't born in the gym; it was born in the wild. Like, because we needed to squat down to pick up shit, we needed to squat down and lift up shit. So it's something that's so fundamental, but it's so limited in our society because we squat into chairs and sit in chairs often. And I'm not trying to demonize sitting. It's a position like any other position. But when you sit in a position, pun intended, in any position for too long, that's when your body starts to adapt to that specific position, and you become unable to achieve other positions that require deeper ranges of motion or certain orientations of joints and tissue that your body isn't used to. So that's when you see issues. So, with the squat, it's so involved. There's so many things going on. You got, to name a few, you got hip flexion, you got knee or tibial external rotation, you got thoracic extension, you got hip internal rotation. Huh?
Ankle.
Yeah, ankle dorsiflexion. You got so much going on. But because of that, and because of all the different prerequisites, quote unquote, necessary for a squat, everyone's squat looks different. No one's squat looks the same. Like, there is no such thing as like the perfect squat, because the perfect squat for me could be different for you. Like, my legs could be longer, or my femurs could be shorter or longer. My hips might sit, the actual ball and socket might sit differently in the actual pelvis. Like, there's so many different things going on there, that it's hard.
Symmetrical too. So much of us are unsymmetrical from injuries, from just being born, especially.
Yeah, exactly. So I mean, there's a lot to consider there. But in general, with people that I see with the squat, the biggest things are people complain about tight hip flexors. Um, and your hip flexors might not actually be quote unquote tight. They may just be weak. I see that really often. And if you look at the psoas muscle, which helps the hip flex above 90 degrees. So if you think about you're standing and you bring your knee right to your hip level, the psoas gets, if you were to put an EMG, you know, if you could onto your psoas, you would see that it's really active above 90 degrees. Um, that tends to be a position we don't really go into that much at all, because in a deep squat, that's what's happening, right? Your knees are basically at your chest and you're sitting really deep, and those hip flexors have to be strong to
Yeah.
maintain that position. But when people try to squat that low, it hurts and it's painful, and you see posterior pelvic tilt, or the butt wink, and
Yep.
that's usually from weak tight hip flexors and weak abs and a weak spine. So correcting that, there's so many levels. I would say the first thing to do would be to look at every single movement the hips can do. So hip flexion, hip extension, abduction, internal rotation, external rotation. I'm gonna miss some. Abduction. Yeah, I think that's it. And then look at your knees, because your knees and your hips are inversely related. When the hip is internally rotated, the knee is externally rotated, or the tibia. And the same thing for external rotation of the hip, the knee is internally rotated. Think about um, when you do a squat. That's one big reason why people's feet turn out when they squat, because they don't have adequate internal rotation. So what has to give? The knees. The knees are going to externally rotate more, or again, the tibia. They're going to turn out more. So that's why you see the feet turn out, because they're trying to give the hips some more room to move. And something has to take the load. Something has to happen, because your body is going to go through the path of least resistance to get from point A to point B.
Yeah.
And that path may not always be beneficial to you, and it may not always be as efficient. You take that turnout in a squat, that's not bad at all. It's 100% not bad. But if those knees aren't ready to take load in that position, aka you haven't trained tibia rotation and you don't know how to actively rotate your tibia, that's when shit gets crazy, and that's when you see knee pain, and you see people with pain on the sides of their knees, and things just get haywire. So um with something as complex as a squat, I would say just figuring out where your weaknesses are and continuing to work on them while you modify, again, the movement to accompany what kind of mobility you have currently, will be the best way to proceed with that second exercise.
Yeah, I think another one that you could throw in there in terms of mobility with the squat is just the shoulders and being able to hold the bar. Um, Squat is definitely something. It's not just squat with weight on your shoulders, or holding dumbbells or a kettlebell squat. It's any body weight squat. When I'm doing
Yeah.
assessment, I see the butt wink right away, and that those shoulders round forward. It's like, all right, we got to work on extension through the thoracic. We got to work on hamstrings. We got to work on hips. There's so many things. I think one thing that's really cool about it all is like movement. I think you alluded to a little bit, is like movement is movement. Whether you're squatting
Yeah.
down to pick something up, or you're squatting down with a heavy dumbbell, like this is all transferable at any point in life. I remember listening to a story John Russin told at a seminar, but he's like, you went to China, somewhere in Asia, and people's mobility was insane. Well, it's because they squatted over the ground or when they went to the bathroom. And so it's like little things like that when we're sitting at our desk all day, we're sitting in our car all day, we go and fly, and then we wonder why we have low back pain and all these things. It's like, it's because we're just in constant forward flexion. So I think squat, definitely a really good one. If you had to pick up one right after the squat. So we went overhead press, overhead with the arms, squat. Is there anything else that people might think that they're doing a good job on, but maybe they need to reevaluate?
Yeah, I would say a pretty popular one among bodybuilders would be, bench press. Um, the bench press is something that's very common. I see it. Yeah, everyone likes to bench, whether it's with dumbbells, whether it's with barbell, whether it's with a push up, right?
Yeah.
It doesn't matter.
Glad to hear.
Yeah,
Just what
so
push-up is. It's all the same movement.
right, it's the same pattern. So that movement requires a lot of things. It's not as intense as like a squat, but there's a lot of things going on with it with a any kind of pushing movement that requires bilateral engagement, both pecs and arms and shoulders and such. Um, but the biggest lapse I see with that movement is shoulder internal rotation. Um, a lot of people don't know this, but you need adequate internal rotation of your shoulders to bench. Because I mean, when you set up in that position, I'm going to show it here. You have to internally rotate your shoulder, and then you're uh, packing your scapula, your shoulder blades in the back to then engage the lats. But while your lats are engaged before you bench, you need shoulder internal rotation. And what happens is when people start benching a lot and they already don't have a lot of shoulder internal rotation, it tends to diminish even more.
You gotta
And those scaps, they elevate, and then you get a lot of anterior damage of the shoulder, and you get a lot of labrums, and you get a lot of issues with that. And it literally all comes from either control or a lack of mobility in those shoulders. So especially when the load gets heavy, like the reason why I stress mobility so much is because I tell people you gotta lift heavy to lose fat. You gotta lift heavy to build muscle. But I'm also stressing mobility because while you're lifting heavy, you got to make sure that your joints are strong in all those ranges of motion, especially when that shit gets heavy. Because if your joints aren't able to do basic movements, what happens when you load them, right? They're gonna buckle, and they're gonna give you a big middle finger, and that's where injuries happen. Um, so the bench would definitely be a close third in terms of an exercise that's done so often, but like gets butchered.
Yeah, it took me like 25 years to even hear the term of getting your lats packed and having the backside of your body active while you're bench pressing. I don't think it's something that's as common knowledge, and I think mobility is definitely on its way up of people being aware of it and prioritizing it. Um, but until people do, people are going to keep getting injured and keep trying to hit those numbers. So
Yep.
it's awesome work that you're doing on that front. Getting into
Thank
like
you.
what you specifically do, one of the things mentioned, you're an online coach with KronicFit, your business, and so
Yep.
how are you able to work with clients and their mobility? I'm guessing you send them videos, they send you videos. You're able to kind of monitor that. When you're in person, it's a lot more hands-on. Well, how does an online coach that works on something like mobility that is so intricate, how does that work?
Yeah, good question. So the online coaching, just specifically from a movement perspective, I think we're gonna get into nutrition a little bit later. But from a movement perspective, I assess every client digitally, joint by joint, everything, and it takes a while. Like it's not a 30-minute assessment. Like so I've had assessments that taken 2 hours because I'm looking at every single piece of the body, like excuse me, from the neck all the way down to the toes. Because when you lift heavy, everything's working, everything's engaged, and everything needs to be strong. If there's any weak links in your joint foundation, or I'll put it in another way, in your house, if you have a brick house with straw foundation, and even if it's not the bottom, let's say like the feet, right? Let's say you have like a bum knee or like a bum shoulder. Let's say some of those bricks are like deteriorating and almost about to implode. That's going to make your house fall down. So every single brick has to be strong in the foundation that is your body, and those bricks are your joints. Every single joint needs to be on point for you to lift pain free and to be strong in those ranges of motion. So I take the time to assess every piece of my client's body and how it moves, and then from there, exactly what you said, I'll send them videos with voiceovers saying we're getting to this position, we're doing this, here's the goal, and inside the actual program would be the sets, the reps, the execution notes, as well as a link to the video, as I said, in a program. And for specific ones that we haven't gone over that I know are difficult, I'll say, hey, send me a video, record yourself, send it to me. Let's see how it goes. And then from there, I'll text them feedback. They'll do it again, and we rinse and repeat that cycle until I feel confident that they're getting into the position safely, correctly, and seeing the changes that they want. Because I mean, I've had clients in the past where um, this is kind of before, as I started like leveling up, so to speak, my business. I would give them stuff, and then I would just say, all right, let's check up in 2 weeks. And I would ask, oh, how'd this one go? How'd this one go? Oh, I didn't really get it, so I didn't do it. Or, it was a little hard, so I did something else. I did this stretch instead. And on me, that was my fault, because number one, I didn't explain the science behind what we were doing. I didn't explain why it was important that they do these movements specifically, and I didn't explain how to achieve the positions modified or not with precision. So that was a big learning point for me. And once we made those corrections, 2 weeks later they saw changes. So it's really about fitting, from a movement perspective, fitting your the programs and the movements and exercises you prescribe to exactly what your client needs.
Yeah, and it's definitely an uphill battle. You look at anytime, I know myself, a lot of people, they go to physical therapy. Here's the exercises to do. You go back in a week, how the exercises go, and you're like, I rolled on the ball for like 5 minutes, and it's
Yeah.
those things that aren't sexy, but that literally lays the foundation. You look at any business, like what's the least sexy thing? Taxes, accounting,
Yeah.
not sexy, but if you don't have that, everything else falls apart. So I really like that
Right.
analogy of brick house. Body's going to find wherever that hole is. Um, Changing gears just a little bit. So we talked a lot of business, a lot of body things, a ton of knowledge on that sense. Last time we chatted, we talked a little bit about meditation and just kind of like how you've changed and grown and kind of in a way become more conscious of who you are and more aware of who you are. I think something that'd be really interesting is just over the last, you know, 4 or 5, however many years, kind of talk about that transformation as a man that you've made, what impact that's made on your business, what impact that's made on, your own health. Because I think that's really beneficial. And that's a conversation that I really want this platform to be for, because it's
Yeah.
so powerful.
Absolutely. Um, so last 4 or 5 years, a lot has changed for me. I would say the biggest thing is just comfort in my own skin,
Yeah.
and being confident with myself, and not even like, pushing my chest out, holding my shoulders back and lifting my head high, like from a postural standpoint, just being comfortable, just like existing in space without worry. I can't really explain it more than that. It's just, I'm in a restaurant eating by myself, and I feel comfortable. Like, I don't feel like, oh, is someone looking at me, or like, is he weird for eating by himself? Like, I don't feel weird for just existing the way I am. I don't feel strange about doing what I like to do because I like to do it. I don't make excuses for um why someone doesn't want to do this or do that. I'm very comfortable with myself. So self-confidence and just comfort is the biggest change. But I actually recently completed a 90-day journal challenge that I was given at the the first mastermind, and I today was day 90.
Yep.
And looking back at where I started, like, holy shit, holy fucking shit, like, I did everything. I did the self affirmations. I did the positive focus, where I'm taking a situation and converting it into a positive every single day, with the exception of some missed days. But for the most part, every day for 90 days. And man, that shit works. That shit fucking works. When you practice, when
That's
you practice, yeah, when you practice finding the positive in a situation, you know, everyday bullshit doesn't bother you anymore. I'll give an example. In my experience, most people get really ticked off by very small, minute things.
yeah.
Um, I was out one night. It was I forgot, maybe it was like a Memorial Day weekend or something. my boy was in town, and we were out having a good time. We went to this after hours spot, and I was with a friend of mine, and they wouldn't let him in because he was wearing shorts, and he like got so upset, so angry. He was like, "Oh, you're not gonna let me in? Like, come on, man, it's blah blah blah. Come on, let me in, let me in, let me in. Come on, come on." And I'm like, "Yo, it's cool. Like, we can just go next week." And I remember being in the opposite position. I remember being so upset about this one moment, this one feeling, this one time that I have to get in this place, or I have to do this thing now, or I can't miss out, right? FOMO. I can't move on to this because I need to do this first. I remember reacting that way to so many different things, like, getting someone stepping on my shoe, or like someone bumping into me, or someone giving me a look. I would question myself. I would say, "Oh my god, they looked at me weird. Am I ugly?" Or, "Oh my god, they looked at me weird. Is there something on my shirt? Oh my god, they looked at me weird. Do they hate me?" You know what I mean? It would, that shit would literally just flood my mind instantly. I would question my own self, from a physical and a mental perspective whenever I was challenged. I would never say, "That's a great point. Let's talk about it." It would be, "Oh my God, no, that's not true. I'm not that." When really that's what I thought about myself,
Yeah.
right? We only react that way if we're actually self-conscious about what the other person's saying. But
Yeah.
if we're confident in ourselves, we can say, "Okay, I see your point. Let's talk about that." And
Yeah.
there's, because there's comfort, right, on both sides. Like, I'm comfortable sharing my opinion of you, and you're comfortable receiving that opinion, letting it digest, and then having a sensible and calm dialogue, as opposed to just a screaming match where both people are just, super self-conscious and just trading insults. And that 100% used to be me. So from these last 4 to 5 years, I've grown stronger. um I would say, in many ways, as a man, because I feel comfortable in my own skin. And I don't think that I could have said that 3 or 4 years ago. I don't think I could have said I truly love myself. And that's hard to say even now, but it's true. Just being honest with yourself, and starting anywhere, and really not being afraid to tackle some of your toughest, darkest demons. Those are the things that are going to hold you back the most. I have demons. Everybody has demons. Everybody has dumb shit that they've done.
Yeah.
Everybody has things that they regret. But you have to embrace the growth that you're capable of, and you have to be confident and faithful that you can make that step and make those steps toward growth. You can't be stuck by yourself and in this like corner, with your demons just like pushing you into a corner, limiting your growth. Accept the things you've done, accept your behaviors, accept your reactions, and then take steps and be honest with yourself about moving forward. Like, be real. Like, what do you really want? Do you want to stay in this position of fear? Do you want to stay in this corner? Do you want to be limited financially, romantically, emotionally, mature, from a maturity standpoint? Like, do you want to stay 22 forever? Do you want to stay 21 forever? Or do you want to grow and become the best version of yourself possible? Like, do you like, it's possible, but you got to face that shit. And in my journaling, I'd face it literally every single day. I would write about it, and I would say, what's the positive of the situation? Sure, this sucks, but what can I learn from this experience so that I can avoid it in the future? What can I take from this shitty experience and learn from it so that when it comes up again, I make the other decision that I wanted to make originally, as opposed to, you know, being upset about something that's already happened. So,
Yeah.
yeah, those are probably the biggest things that's changed for me.
Dude, that's so cool, so powerful. Just
Thank you.
the self-awareness and that self-confidence that comes from it is so powerful. When you talk about, you know, now I feel like you'd say you respond rather than react. And
Yeah.
just how I mentioned it too, in my first podcast, where it's like you got to get quiet, you got to get still, and you got to dive deep down and go face those demons. Because if you don't, it's almost as if like the subconscious is looking for a way for those to come out, And so when you turn, like, when you go face them, you're able to like sit with them, but also when you have that positive focus, now you're subconsciously looking for why things are great. If you're always looking for
Right.
why things are shitty, at the end of the day, everything's shitty, everything's great. At least that's what I like to believe. It's like the grass is greener on both sides. It's also dead on
Right.
both sides. Where are you going to focus? Because whatever you focus on is going to exude, and you're going to find that's going to reveal itself. Um, I love that journaling made that big of an impact on you. And it's super cool because you shared that too every day. 88 out of 90, 89 out of 90, 90 out of 90. For me, that is the coolest kind of transformation before and after that you can see, but it's not as visual. It's up here. And
Right.
you can say that that's changed your life.
Absolutely.
And, I just hope anyone listening to this, here's this story. Here's a man, successful business, really smart guy physically. If you've ever watched him dance, he's got moves.
Thanks.
Like Usher on the story. But then there's that other level, and I feel like when you figure that out, and I'm still trying to figure that out. I know Ron is too, but it brings you to a higher place, and that's what this podcast is all about. Is it's unlocking that mental side, the meditation, that spiritual side, to allow you to get to that better version of yourself that you're never going to totally arrive, but it's that constant climb. So powerful,
Yeah.
dude. I'm hyped. I'm ready to go journal.
Yeah.
Journal to go run through, because the wall wouldn't be enough. Cool. I think that is a ton of value for this podcast. One final question. I like to say that life is like a video game. I say this because I grew up playing video games, but it's like you got to, at some point, you got to choose, like, all right, what kind of character are you going to be? Ron's chose, he's like, all right, I'm going to be a mobility guy. If you got to redo your entire playthrough and do something completely different, for example, like I would love to be a Nat Geo photographer, sit in the fjords in Norway and film orcas and like the pods swimming around me. Like, what would you do if you got another chance at dropping your skill points into something?
Yeah. I like this question a lot. It's really hard for me to think about that for a few reasons. The first one is I've come to learn that it's really cheesy, but everything happens for a reason. You meet the right people at the right times, you do the right things at the right times, and you make mistakes when you need to. And you know, when you're more self-aware and you see things differently and you're more observant, you can see why that decision you made in 2010 impacted your life in 2019 and will in 2025, and all those things. So I will say I wouldn't change anything because I like what's happened to my life and I like where I am, and I know that if I didn't make those mistakes earlier in my life, I would make them now, and I would, what I mean? And the same thing, I'm going to say the same thing when I'm 30. I know I'm going to make more mistakes. We all make mistakes. You're going to keep making mistakes, but it's part of life. But if it was a perfect world and I could just like change and put my skill points and drop them somewhere else and do things differently, I would be a professional dancer who games and does Twitch and shit. Like I would, that would be fucking amazing, man. Just to get paid to dance and play video games, like fuck, that'd be awesome.
Imagine just unlocking like a new move, and you're like, oh, I'm gonna wreck people on Twitch.
Yeah,
Move that I just unlocked.
yeah.
Dude, awesome. I'm pumped. Spiritually, I feel ready to roll. Thank you again so much. Real quick though, where can people find you? How can people find you? Connect. His Instagram's loaded with videos that will help you, whether you are training, doing yoga, doing anything movement related. So I'll let Ron take it though. Where can they find you?
Appreciate it. So a couple ways you can find me on Instagram at Coach Kronic, CoachKronic. You can find me on Facebook as well, Coach Kronic, CoachKronic. I'm starting to upload to my YouTube, but it's still pretty slow. Just look up Coach Kronic, and you'll find me. The next thing is my website. That's kronic.fit, exactly how it sounds, KRONIC.fit, really simple. And you can listen to Paul's podcast on my podcast. That's the Kronic Lifestyle. That's on iTunes and Google Play, I think. It's Google Play is weird, but yeah, that's how you can find me.
Cool. Awesome, man. Again, thank you so much for coming on. Other than that, see you soon and have a great day. Later, man.
Appreciate you, man. Peace.
That was Coach Karon, mobility expert. Check him out on the Kronic Lifestyle podcast. Hope you really enjoyed this podcast. Hopefully it gave you some things to think about around mobility. I'll drop the show notes in the summary. You can find them at downdogathletics.com. If you got any value out of this podcast, share it with a friend, share it with a homie. So much of what we do, so much of what I and Karan do is training people physically. This is my way of helping people train their mind as well. If you have any questions or want to chat, shoot me a DM or email me, paul@downdogathletics.com. Otherwise, catch you next time on the Down Dog Athletics podcast.